Oh, good evening. It is a little bit after 6, so we'll go ahead and get started for tonight. I'm sure some more people will be coming in along the way, but welcome. Hope everyone's having a good Monday and your week is off to a great start. This is, I guess, technically week number 4 for us. So this week we're looking at administrative aspects of federalism. Then remember, next Monday is Veterans Day, and so in observance of Veterans Day, the campus is closed, so we will not have a Zoom session next Monday on the 11th. Our next Zoom session will then be on the 18th, and on the 18th, we'll then get into our discussion of some of the current and future issues of relevance to intergovernmental relations. We'll do that on the 18th, and then we'll have to have our Saturday class on the 23rd so we can finish up the remaining articles that we have discussion scheduled for. You have another discussion board coming due for next week. And in that discussion board, number 4, you are looking at some of the information that we used last week in looking at the fiscal aspects of intergovernmental relations. And what I'm asking you to do in that discussion board, number 4, is to select a grant that is intergovernmental in nature, a grant that has some intergovernmental components to it. Discuss that grant and then some possible changes that you would recommend to make that grant more effective and more efficient. So it can be any grant that you want to choose. It can be something you're familiar with and you've worked with before. If you haven't worked with intergovernmental grants in the past, it could be a grant that you are interested in or applies to a policy field that you're interested in. Just make sure that whatever grant that you select to use as a topic for discussion forum number 4 has some intergovernmental aspects to it, that it somehow crosses over national, state, or state, local, or national, local lines, that there is that intergovernmental type of component, and then you'll just be recommending some changes that you think would make the grant more effective and more efficient. So that's discussion board number 4. Now, as I said, for tonight, we are looking at the administrative aspects of federalism. So far we've gone through the constitutional aspects, the political aspects, the fiscal aspects, and tonight we're going to look at those administrative aspects. So we originally have 5 articles on our agenda for discussion tonight. Denise is under the weather, and so the American Public Administration article, we're going to hold off on that one until November 18th. So tonight we only have 4 articles on the agenda, so this might be a little bit shorter of a class session than normal. But the ones we have on our agenda for tonight, Esmeralda asked to go first, and so Esmeralda's is on the another look at bargaining article. Then we have Alexa with the 10th Commandments article, Caitlin with the Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations article, and then Vu with the politics of unfunded mandates. And so those are our 4 articles we have for tonight. Before we get into our article discussions, just one more quick reminder about the article critiques. They have been flowing in, but remember, if you haven't turned in a critique yet, your article critique must be turned in before we are scheduled to discuss the article in class. And so if you haven't turned in the ones on political or fiscal federalism, that ship has already sailed. So if you haven't turned in the critiques, you're going to have to look at one of the articles scheduled for either the 18th or on the 23rd. Alrighty, any questions before we get going for this evening? I have gone ahead and enabled screen sharing. So for our 4 discussion leaders tonight, whenever it comes your time to lead your discussion, you should be able to share your screen if you have any slides that you'd like to share with us, and should work very well. So without further ado, let's start with Esmeralda, because I know that Esmeralda has appointments just to get to at 7 o'clock. So we'll start with you tonight, and you can take us through another look at bargaining.
Thank you, Professor. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will be presenting on another look at bargaining and negotiating in intergovernmental management. So just the agenda, I'm going to do Think Notice Act activity, then I'll go over the first main portion of the main points, discussion, second main points of the article, discussion, relevance today, a little bit more discussion, and a conclusion. So for the first discussion-based activity, I provide an image, and I would like if people can chime in, what do they think about the image or what do they think is going on? For the notice, what do you see? And for act, what actions can be taken?
Esmeralda, I don't think your slides are in presentation mode, so I don't think they're advancing. We're just kind of seeing the outline of the slides.
Let me try something else then. Mm, Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. So what do we think about the image? What do we see? And what actions can be taken? Keeping in mind what we have been discussing in class, um, intergovernment relationships, relationships between local, state, and the federal government. And anyone can chime in because I have a hard time seeing like the hands raised.
Well, I was gonna say it looks like there's some volunteers helping to manage a line.
Thank
Um,
you. Anyone else for what they think is going on? So, well, it was just mentioned, we can see that there's volunteers getting in line. There's this section here where it says COVID check-in. So one can argue that they think this is during the pandemic, they think this is either a COVID test or a vaccination clinic. What actions can be taken if we were called? Some facilities ran this much more smoother than others, and then we can also take it to like different states reacting differently. Some states were able to apply for federal funding because of their political alignment. Maybe they were Democratic and they were okay with the limiting of restrictions in comparison to Republican states where they were a little bit more delayed in applying for funding. So this is a good example of what we're going to talk about in the article, differences in like political realms, in the local, state, federal government, and how politics and social factors do impact the negotiating and bargaining. So one of the main points for the article is it argues that about the complexity of intergovernment relationships. We have different layers of government as seen as depicted here in the image. We have city, county, state, federal, and it's an integral relationship between all different components that heavily rely on different negotiation skills. And I think this is really true, in especially in the 21st century. The claim is valid, but it's also important to note that what is really not considered is the political aspect to it, meaning that the negotiation skills are independent of the political affiliation, meaning that the person serving as a public servant does have to have good negotiation skills, good bargaining skills, good listening skills. Um, but the actions that this person takes ultimately do align to the political party. Um, and I do want to point out that the authors do not directly state, like in a quote or in a section, but readers, and I was able to infer that their argument was that political alignment is what determines what is negotiated, what is bargained, what is brought to the table, even of what is of importance. Um, because ultimately they're trying to ensure that they align politically to their respective political party in order to gain votes and traction. Um, and then there are different tactics that the government officials use. Sometimes it's like collaborating with different officials, or they compete against each other, as we see like different political parties competing against each other. But an important thing is, even though that there might be competition, the authors argue that it's important for there to be a sense of transparency, regardless whether there's alignment or not in bargaining and negotiations. So the decision that is made can be in the most informed manner possible. And the big takeaway is that intergovernment relationships are very complex and multi-layered, but transparency and communication can help alleviate the complexity of it. So some discussion questions. Why do you think there is complexity in intergovernmental relationships? What are some examples of complex intergovernmental relationships? How is the complexity of intergovernment relationships present in your field of work?
Hi, Esmeralda. I think one of the things that adds a lot of complexity in intergovernmental relationships is control by different political parties at different layers of government. For example, the tension between various states that are controlled by one party when another party has power in the federal government. And then even within that, when cities are controlled by governments that are politically at odds with the people who run their state for various political reasons.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing. I agree. I think we can see this in different like layers, like how you mentioned, like between different states, or even like how you brought a good example, like in California, although in the last election it was dominantly Democratic blue, there were some regions within California that were red, and we saw obviously conflict between those states, regions or cities, and that can create complexity, um, especially in terms of like funding, if they want to adhere to all those federal regulations, or they might opt not to apply to funding. Those are good points. Thank you, Daniel. Anyone else? I think, in my opinion, it's also complex because of the history of how the United States was founded. It was 13 colonies, and then they morphed into states. And essentially, since the beginning, states had more of a say in the national government, and national government was just there to check them. But they've always had more of a power in how to run things, and even early disputes in our nation. So it's complex because of the history, but also trying to meet like the different needs and wants of the constituents and different layers of government. So for the second major part of the article, it mentioned how it's super important, the historical context plays in the bargaining process, um, as well as like within the historical time period, the politics of the time, the social factors, um, just can either really push for a certain agenda or be against it. Um, and they are also arguing that the public servants may not realize this, but it's super detrimental to the bargaining process. Um, and then it's also noted that there are different pillars of bargaining and negotiation. that allow interaction between governments. There are a total of four. The first one is the importance of territorial place. This I kind of touched on upon a little bit, but essentially it's emphasizing that the territory or place um, are important because of territorial democracy and jurisdiction in the context of like state, local, and federal government can either allow for a collaboration or competition. Um, and this is true because, like I mentioned earlier, the 13 colonies struggled to agree on different issues of statehood, territory, and representation. And that all had to do with jurisdiction. Um, so therefore, since the foundation of the United States history, there has been such a heavily emphasis on the importance of jurisdiction. The second pillar of bargaining is limited national bureaucracy. And this has been almost like an American tradition in which the states have more of a say in their respective states instead of the national government. Um, and again, I argue that this claim is valid because um, the US was founded by the creation of states being supported by this limited national bureaucracy. The third pillar focuses on a multi-level, um, almost simultaneous actions that all governments practice, which is what we come to know as cooperative federalism. And in itself, it can also be competitive or collaborative. Um, and both of the authors argue that, like, they present this point. But I think it's equally important to take note that there have been moments throughout history where there has been more of a collaboration in comparison to competition and vice versa, and sometimes a mix of both. Um, an example that I can think of this is in terms of like environmental protection. Um, the collaborative aspects are shared responsibilities between different states or countries, while the competitive aspects are like policy innovations. Um, so that's just a little bit of that. And the fourth pillar is the interactive administrative action, which essentially the people in administrative roles and in different levels of government have to interact with each other, even though they might have like opposing agendas or different political agendas. They're supposed to find a common ground and be transparent in order to collectively bargain and be successful in negotiating. So just two discussion questions. How do politics, social factors, and historical contents influence the bargaining process? And the second question is, does politics or social factors have more of an influence on the bargaining process, in your opinion? You can just chime in and check the chat.
Hey, Esmeralda, I was just gonna say maybe those things create a bias. So the bargaining may sway one way based on each of those factors.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like in terms of politics, it can be individual politics. Each person has their certain perspective and beliefs, and even both parties, so that can bring a bias, and it can also like limit how open-minded they are about particular issues. Um, that's a good example. I think of COVID where it put the picture how different just states within the US reacted differently. I think California was one of the first states to like impose like certain restrictions and like curfew and be a little bit more restrictive um, because they had applied to federal funding and they wanted to access those funds. in comparison to other states that maybe were a little bit hesitant to place those restrictions. And I think that speaks of like their perspectives as those political parties, because some were more accepting of COVID and others were, they accepted it, but they didn't accept all the restrictions. Anyone else want to add something? I'm going to move on. The second question is more like in your opinion, whether politics or social factors have more of an influence. I think it's definitely politics, in my opinion, because we're very political in this country, and everything to a certain extent ties back to politics, especially in this election year. And therefore, sometimes social factors or things that happen like COVID tend to become more political instead of a social need to just address the problems. So the art relevance for today, I found it to be really useful in terms of today. It shows how complex and multi-layered the nature of intergovernment relationships are, and how important the fact that politics plays on it and social factors, as well as the historical context, the historical time period um, in the bargaining process. And all the claims that the authors make are valid in the 21st century. Um, and something that really I took away is that intergovernmental is very has a lot of complexity to it. But the best way to think about it, it's kind of similar like life. Life is very intricate. It can be very complex, sometimes complicated, and or like relationships. And this can be best navigated through communicating to the best of one's ability. And this can be applied to different layers of government, local, city, state, the national government. They keep a line of communication open, um, and be transparent with each other and have mutual respect, understand the why they exist, and respect that can allow for the complexity to be less uh, tedious. And I think it takes a special types of people to work in government, um, because those are not easy things to do, but it can be accomplished. And social factors and politics do influence the bargaining process in intergovernmental relations. Um, my question here is, what are some ideas or suggestions to navigate the complex nature of intergovernment relationships, like from the perspective of like a public servant or somebody working in the public sector?
I think you just always have to know your audience. And I think that you have to understand, depending on who you're working with, what are their goals, right? And how is it that you can help the person that you're working with meet their goals in terms of whether it's grant management or project implementation. If you're working with like elected officials at a certain level of government, you always have to ensure that you're working within the parameters of what they want.
I agree, Daniel. I feel like it's super important to remember who the constituents are, and as people, like who do we serve, what service do we provide, in order to understand the why and make it less complex. But even then, I find that sometimes some people in public positions, public sectors, they forget their why, and therefore they have such a difficult time like navigating the ropes. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think the biggest takeaway from this article is understanding that one, it's inevitable for intergovernment relationships to be um, complex. That's their nature, and being transparent, communicating, and having mutual respect and understanding the whys between different sections or ropes can be beneficial. Thank you, Daniel. Anyone else? Okay, I'm gonna move on to the conclusion. Just to conclude, government is very complex. It's inevitable. Politics, social factors influence the bargaining process, and ultimately, those do have an effect on the ability for change to occur at either a decent rate or for it to just prolong change. But I think it's important to note in order to um, move forward in our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esmeralda. And I agree that, with one of the major themes that comes out of the article is this whole idea of the complexity. And, whenever you add bargaining and negotiation into your analysis, it's obviously going to become a lot more complex than if you're just working through normal, visible governmental channels. And one interesting thing in the article that I like a lot is I like the examples that Agronoff provides, and he's got a few examples, but one of the examples is from this city, a suburb called Garfield Heights. And he said, so Garfield Heights puts in, usually every year, they would put in 6 applications for CDBG funding. And so this CDBG funding is being done on a project basis. And so the potential recipients will put out their proposals. And Cuyahoga County, which is the county in which Garfield Heights is located, only wanted cities to put in 2 proposals. And typically a city would put in 2 proposals, and then either one of those proposals would get funded or neither proposal would get funded. Well, here you have a city that's putting in 6. So the county comes to the city and says, we don't want you putting in 6 proposals anymore. It's just too much work for us. And so the city then responds and says, okay, we won't put in 6, we'll only put in 2, as long as you can guarantee to us that both of those proposals will get funded. That's some of that, behind closed doors type of bargaining that goes on that we oftentimes don't talk a lot about when we're talking about intergovernmental relations. The other example that I like a lot is the example of Ithaca, Michigan. So the author says, in Ithaca, Michigan, the EPA wanted to do this testing of water in Ithaca, Michigan. And so Ithaca, Michigan says, okay, fine, you can do this type of testing. And the EPA says, okay, well, we're going to charge you for the tests that we run if we run these tests. And Ithaca, Michigan says, well, okay, well, if you're going to charge us for the test, we are going to charge you for the water that we provide to you in order to run that test. So it's kind of a comical type of example, but I think it does a good job of illustrating some of this behind the scenes bargaining that does go on. I think that the whole idea that we need this renewed research agenda in intergovernmental relations, in that renewed research agenda needs to look more at the role of bargaining and negotiation, I think that's very true. I do think that we need to look more at this bargaining that goes on, but the problem with that is it's difficult. That if we, want to observe the normal governmental channels, of communication, we'll watch a live stream of a city council meeting or a school board or a board of supervisors. It's all very visible. It's something that we have access to. However, a lot of the bargaining that goes on between federal, state, and local administrators, it's not broadcast. It's not available to us necessarily as researchers. So in order to find out what's going on in these bargaining and negotiation types of relationships, we have to put in a lot more work as researchers. We really have to get involved in collecting the qualitative and quantitative data and sitting down with these administrators and finding out how they interacted with administrators from other levels of government. It's a much more time and resource intensive process to collect our information in order to conduct research into the bargaining negotiation that goes on in these intergovernmental relationships. So I agree with Esmeralda. The basic theme here is we need to focus more on bargaining negotiations, but we have to recognize that it's a very complex way of studying intergovernmental relations. And it's going to take us a lot more time, a lot more resources. It's also going to take us a lot more critical thinking to really figure out exactly how we are going to learn what's going on in these bargaining sessions that are actually happening behind closed doors that are not necessarily open to the public. So it does make it more difficult for us to study intergovernmental relations, but I think it's a much more appropriate way for us to study intergovernmental relations because there is so much negotiation, so much bargaining that does go on behind those closed doors. So just an interesting recommendation to us for how we can move forward in having a more modern approach to studying intergovernmental relations. Well, thank you very much, Esmeralda. Thank you for getting us started with that first article tonight. Now for our second article, we will circle back to the 10th Commandments article, and that one belongs to Alexa.
Hello. I apologize in advance. My husband is working late and I have no childcare, so I have an infant with me. I'm gonna do my best here. I'm sorry for the lack of professionalism. I'm so sorry. Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay. So my article was on the 10th Commandments by Pietro Nivola. And in this article, we explore how federal mandates federal mandates create both opportunities and challenges within US cities. So federal policies are intended to uplift cities, but sometimes they burden them with financial and administrative challenges. So Nivola examines these issues in his article and highlights the balance between federal influence and local autonomy. So some urban challenges and federal influence. Urban population loss despite economic growth in the 1990s. Many US cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, Milwaukee continued to lose residents to suburban areas. And in some cases, suburbs saw as much as 75% of metropolitan population growth, while cities stagnated or declined in their populations. We also saw employment shifts to the suburbs. So even as private sector jobs grew, 82% of cities saw a decreasing share of regional jobs. So for example, Washington, D.C.'s job share dropped from 1/3 to 1/4 in just 7 years. And Atlanta's share declined from 40% to 24%. We also saw persistent poverty. So while poverty levels in the cities dropped in the 1990s, inner cities still had really high concentration of low-income residents compared to the suburbs. So cities like New Orleans and Philadelphia supported a disproportionate share of welfare recipients relative to their population size. So local revenue dependence, unlike cities in Europe that Nivola very lightly touches on, where municipal budgets are often relying on much larger financial funding, US cities derive about 2/3 of their revenue locally. So by contrast, German cities rely on local funds for only 1/3 of their budgets, and British local councils depend on even less. We also have increasing federal mandates. Federal mandates have increased significantly since the 1960s, requiring cities to fund numerous projects for infrastructure improvements, environmental compliance, and other things with limited federal aid. And so cities like Detroit were already economically strained, and they had limited resources to meet their obligations. And so this led to higher taxes and weakened financial stability. We also had rising local taxes. So approximately 40% of cities reported increased difficulty in meeting their financial needs by the late 1990s. As federal funding declined, property taxes rose, further burdening city residents and making it difficult for urban centers to compete with the suburbs. So this leads us to question 1. Does anybody have any thoughts on what potential benefits and challenges of US cities relying on local funding are? I'm having trouble seeing if anybody is sharing, so feel free to chime in.
I'll chime in and make that boo. I was gonna say it actually varies greatly. In the city where I live, and I'm pretty fortunate to be in Irvine, where there's a large mix of commercial businesses. So a lot of the revenues actually come from a pretty affluent base. So we don't have too much of an issue. But where my parents live, and I'm sure you're a lot more familiar with northern Orange County cities, for example, I think they're facing a lot more in terms of being able to rely on local revenue sources, property taxes, for example. And I've seen property tax rates in northern OC counties being a lot, or cities being a lot higher than what we pay down here in South County. That's something I've kind of observed more recently.
Yeah, you make a lot of really great points too. Anybody else have anything that they wanted to chime in with?
Well, I just imagine that if the cities are relying on their local funding, they have a lot more control over it. There's probably fewer mandates given from other levels of government.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So there is a lot of local autonomy. They have a lot more control over their budgets. And then on the flip side, there's also, with the local funding, you have a lot more accountability as well. So with that direct influence, you're also answering to people directly on what changes you're making and how you're handling your funds. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was gonna say, if, for example, you have a tourist town and you're relying and it's doing really great in a boom, that if for some reason all those eggs in one basket doesn't work anymore, now that funding is not coming in because that industry is not working, whether it's that or something else. So that could be a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel like we're seeing that a lot these days. I work in the engineering division of a city, and we're finding that a lot of our local funding is beginning to go down. And our road conditions are continuing to fail, and we don't have enough funding to keep up with the cost of materials and services for the amount of money that we're receiving. Anyone else?
I think to add with what you said, coupled with the fact that their inflation has made everything much more expensive, that makes things even harder to sustain or to even plan in the future when there's a lot of variability of how much things cost.
Yeah, definitely. We see a lot of variance in projections. And so like every year, one of the things that we do with our capital budget is, we plan based on the funding we anticipate getting, but it's hard to project accurately when, there's a volatile economy or costs go up so exorbitantly. And, you're not quite sure what to expect in terms of what kinds of construction bids or what kinds of material bids are coming.
Or you also see, if I could chime in, you also see where the community is impacted, because if you're having impacts with local resources, what tends to happen is the agency may put in a measure for taxes to increase the taxes for that offset for specific purposes, but then it often also results in tax increases as well.
Yeah, that's another great point. Another thing that I was thinking about is how there tends to be kind of an inequality in funding across cities. Richer cities tend to bring in more money and therefore have a lot more funding to do things, whereas less wealthy cities tend to suffer.
It's also too where it's allocated as well, because I've seen cities that have larger budgets. It's how they allocate it into what. Some tend to sway it towards, your parks and libraries, where the majority those tend to suffer, because although they're important to the community, maybe capital improvement or projects tend to be more important. So those resources are diverted from, your parks programs, for streets as well. So I agree with that as well.
Anyone else? All right, gonna move us along. Thank you, everybody, for your input. So along the lines of what we were just talking about, one of the major pain points that we see is urban schools under pressure. And this tends to have a lot of impact in terms of people moving out of these areas to live a more suburban lifestyle. So a couple of these are administrative costs. Urban schools devote a large share of their budgets to, or according to this article, urban schools devote a large share of their budget to non-teaching administrative roles, which are largely due to the complexity of federal regulations. We have special education mandates that are passed down by the feds and the state, and they require substantial funding for urban districts, often bearing the brunt of expenses. An example is District of Columbia, that was cited in the article, allocates a third of its education budget to special education, and it leaves fewer resources for other educational needs. So circling back to that distribution. We also have suburban flight impact. Urban schools are constrained by limited funding and they're struggling with lower performance outcomes. So they've led many families to move to suburban areas where schools have better resources and higher performance. And that drives up population in suburban areas and away from cities. So that leads us to question 2. How do federal requirements for urban schools, or in general, contribute to suburban migration patterns? So again, some things might be impacts on urban schools would be like funding constraints. Again, those mandates that kind of take a hold on budgets and require a specific amount to be allocated. Low school performance, which kind of acts in a vicious cycle. Low performance leads to limited funding, but the performance happens because of limited funding. Contribution to suburban migration is like families who move to the suburbs for those better school options. And so they perceive that they have fewer financial constraints and stronger academic outcomes. And, we should also keep in mind that this might be due to, families who do seek out better or stronger education, tend to be more involved with their kids. And so that might skew these outcomes, but that was listed in the article. And potential solutions. We could look to weight funding formulas. You could adjust them and give different aid distributions to schools in economically disadvantaged areas. You can increase federal funding for special education in general, so provide federal funding. This comes down to, again, those budget constraints where we are expected to meet mandates, but we are not given the funding or resources to meet them. And then local innovation grants, to name a few. Federal intervention and local autonomy. So local autonomy versus federal directives. Federal mandates often restrict city government's flexibility. Many cities already are financially strained, and so they have to allocate funds to meet those mandates. And it leaves less for other essential local services and innovations. We have the mandate millstone, which was Millstone was a former New York City mayor who described federal mandates as recognizing that while some mandates improve welfare, others strain cities' resources. So for instance, New York City had anticipated an $8 billion in federally mandated water quality projects. And so that's a cost that's really difficult to meet amid already high taxes and other debts and other needs within the city. And then last, we have trade-offs. So while federal regulations aim to ensure consistent quality and welfare standards, they often create unintended financial stress on cities. So balancing national and local needs involves difficult trade-offs and requires thoughtful prioritization that sometimes you don't see at the macro level. And this leads us to question 3. What might be some unintended consequences of federal mandates designed to promote public welfare?
Well, I think for me, as someone who is able to support families in their IEP process, I get the opportunity to see the variety of approaches towards services, but by different, school districts, small, large, covering different cities, geographical areas, and so forth. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about some examples of smaller school districts I see within the catchment area that I work in. They have mandates for specific services, but they simply just don't have the resources, the staffing, the specialists needed to determine what level of service, a student needs. Um, there's just so many things, even the facilities, a lot of times they're very limited as to the number of programs that could be offered. So when I think of mandates, and I know that are not all federal in nature, I just think of, how some specific organizations or school districts are less able to meet those mandates because of their limitations and their resources.
Yeah, great point. And it comes back to that disjoint, administration does not really, does not really communicate well with policy, or vice versa. And so you end up, with this, well-to-do initiative that they really do want to improve services, or maybe they want to, make it look like they want to improve services, but it makes it nearly impossible at the local level to actually administer those new policies because the resources just don't exist. Anybody else?
I'll chime in on this one. I work for a public water agency in SoCal, and one of the biggest, I guess, unfunded mandate we had to abide by is the EPA lead and copper rule revision, LCRR. They required an actual in-person field testing of a certain number of connections throughout your service area to establish a confidence interval to show that there is no lead or within your service area. And this all stemmed from the whole Flint incident. What's puzzling is that a lot of the lead piping or locations where lead occurred were in areas that were constructed way back in like the 50s or 60s. We make the argument that because South Orange County was developed at a much later date when the requirement for plumbing was a lot more stringent without being able to use lead, therefore wouldn't have any lead service lines. However, the EPA still required us to actually go out there to perform the in-field verification, or at least 10% to establish that confidence interval to show that there is no lead, and there is no lead basically. So the cost that was incurred would have benefited in other areas as opposed to spending on area that we were highly confident wouldn't happen or did not have any lead. So that's something that we encountered more recently that kind of came to my mind.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I don't know much about water utility, but I do know that our city is dealing a lot with PFAS fallout right now, and getting up to date with all of the new findings and mandates that are attached to that. And we're in the same boat where we are having to make a lot of updates and run a lot of testing, and it's causing us to use a ton of resources that put a huge strain on our budget. All right, and as a follow-up, can anybody think of any successful policies that have helped to balance out some of these needs between the federal mandates and then administering at the local level? One example that Dr. Powell touched on recently on an unrelated discussion just before this was community development block grants. They provide federal funding that cities can use to support different community projects and help to support the mandates that are coming down from the feds and the state, requiring new housing developments. Another one that I have is opportunity zones. Using opportunity zones which offer different tax benefits to investors in economically distressed areas to attract businesses and improve economic growth in urban areas. All right, this concludes my discussion. Thank you guys for your participation. And I'll pass it back over to you, Dr. Powell.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexa. Well done. And yeah, it is interesting, this article, just the recognition that different local governments have different capabilities. And so when you have mandates that are being handed down to these local governments, different governments are going to respond differently and going to have different capabilities to withstand those types of mandates. One really good, I think, frame of reference here that goes beyond the article. This isn't the article, but a frame of reference that kind of helps us understand some of the differences between local governments and their capabilities goes to public choice theory. And whether you are an advocate of public choice theory or not, there was a famous economist by the name of Charles Thibault. And Charles Thibault made the argument that each local government produces its own bundle of goods and services. And so it will produce a bundle of goods and services, and then citizens can choose which bundle of goods and services they prefer by essentially voting with their feet. And so if you like the bundle of goods and services being provided by city B, then you move from city A to city B. The problem with that is that, and as the article references, education and the quality of schooling was one of the primary reasons why we saw a lot of citizens voting with their feet and moving out of these urban areas and into suburban areas, and actually moving into some, secondary and tertiary suburbs as well. It was primarily for the quality of schooling. And so they had preferred that bundle of goods and services that they were getting in those suburbs. The problem with that is, as those residents move, the residents who have the ability to vote with their feet, those tend to be your more affluent residents. Residents who do not have the ability to move, they don't have the financial wherewithal to move, they tend to stay in those urban areas. So you kind of get a hollowing out of the tax base of that urban area as these more affluent residents then move to the suburbs. So the tax base gets smaller and the fiscal capacity of that urban area then is reduced. And so it's less, the city is then less able to respond to these mandates because they have less tax dollars. Also, in conjunction with the loss of tax revenue, you then also have an increase in the service demands that are being placed upon that urban government by the citizens who remain within that urban area. And that's something that's touched on by the article as well, is that you have these urban areas that have a lot more service demands being placed upon them. And so if these mandates come along and then they place demands upon the city as well, the city, something's got to give. And the city cannot continue to provide services to its citizens while at the same time responding to the fiscal impacts of these mandates. So it's almost this catch-22 type of situation that not only do they lose their affluent residents, but at the same time they're losing tax base, then the service demands are then being increased upon the city as well. So different local governments will have different ability to respond to these mandates. And I know in the article they refer to it as the shift in the shaft, in that You shift responsibilities down to local governments, and then you give them the shaft by then removing money from them. So you give them more things they have to do, but then take away the subsidiarity, if you will, the fiscal ability for them to respond to those new requirements. One of the types of local governments that is most susceptible to mandates will be schools. And he points out in the article how urban schools suffer the most from these mandates because they are special purpose governments. I think one of the things we do a disservice to federalism with is when we talk about federal versus state versus local, but we really don't ever dig down and drill down into local governments and the different types of local governments. General purpose governments would traditionally have more resources at their disposal. They will traditionally have more flexibility and latitude in terms of how they govern themselves as compared to a special purpose government. So a city or a county is going to have more latitude and flexibility than a sewer district or a school district. So here what we're seeing is that the type of government that is most negatively impacted by this shift and shaft tends to be urban school districts. And as Alexa pointed out to us, one of the primary areas where this occurs is in terms of special education funding. And so you have all of these federal mandates in terms of special education, these things that these urban school districts need to do. But then special education is being reimbursed at a rate of about 30 to 40%. That leaves 60 to 70% of the costs of these special education mandates that must then be borne by these urban school districts. Well, these urban school districts don't have the same access to tax revenue as general purpose governments would have. They don't have the same type of flexibility in terms of how they can respond to these mandates. And so what happens is you end up with what's called in the local education system here in California, what's known as a special education bleed, in that you have to then start paying for all these federal mandates in special education with general fund revenue. Once that general fund revenue goes toward paying for these special education mandates, then there are opportunity costs in that that money is no longer then available for other types of expenditures. And so I think we have to ask the question about what type of local government we are looking at in order to really discern what is the true impact of a federal mandate on that local government, because not all local governments are created equal. And there is also an interesting point brought up in the discussion about local funding. And what's the advantage here in the US when you have cities that are deriving 2/3 of their revenue from local funding as opposed to some European counterparts? What is the advantage of that? And one of the advantages of that is more control. That when local governments derive a lot of the revenue from local funding, they have control over that local funding. And so they are able to have more control over that funding than they would have control over federal grants. Federal grants are transient. Federal grants may be here today and they may be gone tomorrow. Same type of thing with state grants. The problem is that when you have these urban areas that do not have the taxing capacity, they cannot be reliant upon local funding because they don't have that capacity to do so. So they then become more reliant upon intergovernmental sources of revenue. The more reliant you are on intergovernmental sources of revenue, the more temporary those sources of revenue are, and the more questions you have about whether or not you're going to have that money in the future. One very famous budgeting scholar, and I used to use his textbook all the time when I taught public budgeting, John Mikesell. And John Mikesell, his primary recommendation to local governments is that in order to survive fiscal stress in times of fiscal crisis, you do two things. The first thing you do is to diversify your revenue portfolio. And the second thing you do is try to avoid relying too much on intergovernmental grants. And those are the two pieces of advice that he has for local governments to survive fiscal stress. Unfortunately, a lot of our metropolitan areas, a lot of our large cities don't have the ability to do those two types of things. But I'll stop talking now. But thank you, Alexa. Again, it really does give us this idea. I love the title of the article, Tense Commandments, because it is very tense and creates a very tense relationship when you have the national government coming in and telling governments to do things without them providing them with subsidiarity, without providing them with the resources they need to do those things and abide by those mandates. It is 7 o'clock, but we only have 4 articles tonight. So if it's okay with everyone, let's keep on moving instead of taking a break, and then we'll be able to get you out of here early tonight. Our third article is kind of a descriptive article, but an extremely important one. And that one belongs to Caitlin, and that's the techniques of intergovernmental relations. So I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me see. I'm going to try to share this. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Just like you said, I'll be discussing Chapter 21, the Techniques of Intergovernmental Regulations by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. This chapter immediately opens up by explaining to us that the new regulations impose mandatory compliance on state and local governments, whereas in the past, assistance programs operated under a contractual relationship between equal levels of government. In this new form, non-compliance can lead to federal sanctions, which makes it increasingly difficult for states to avoid these regulations. The bulk of this chapter covers the legal and fiscal strategies the national government employs to obtain compliance. These strategies include direct orders, cross-cutting requirements, crossover sanctions, and partial preemption. So to get started, the first of the 4 strategies is called direct orders. It is exactly what it sounds like it is. Direct orders outline the federal regulations of state and local governments, which involve direct legal orders that carry civil or even criminal penalties for non-compliance. The first example our chapter provides us with is the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, which essentially prohibits job discrimination against race, color, religion, sex, disability, among other groups. This statute extended to the state and local level and imposed requirements on private employers. Additionally, our authors gave us the example of the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act amendments of 1977, which prohibited cities from ocean dumping sewage sludge. Both of the acts are established at the federal level, and if violated at the state or local level, the result can yield a very strong negative criminal or civil penalty, like mentioned. However, most federal regulations take a different approach, often exempting state and local governments from direct statutes that apply to businesses. As demonstrated in our article, the OSHA is cited as an exemption from its provisions as employers. Other political considerations and constitutional limitations also influence this relationship. In contrast, states can legally mandate local governments since they're created by state law, making such direct orders common at the state level. So based on the information provided us by the chapter, can you provide me with any examples of a direct order issued by the federal government and imposed on the state or local government?
Yeah, I have one, the American Disabilities Act.
Mm-hmm.
We're like working for a city we constantly do inventory of our facilities and make sure they're in compliance with the American Disabilities Act. On top of that too, if on private property, if somebody needs some type of accommodation, it trumps, for lack of a better term, it trumps our zoning codes, and we would have to allow them that accommodation.
Yeah, good. Does anyone else have any other examples? I personally found another good example of a direct order issued by the federal government was the Clean Air Act. The federal legislation establishes national air quality standards to protect public health and the environment. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA has the authority to set specific air quality standards that states have to follow. If the state fails to comply with the standards, EPA can actually impose penalties, which include federal funding cuts or enforcement actions against the state. This law demonstrates how direct orders can mandate compliance from state and local governments, carrying significant consequences for noncompliance, such as the civil penalties or sanctions. Okay, on to our next. So cross-cutting. Cross-cutting requirements are broadly applicable regulations imposed on federal grants to promote national, social, and economic policies. A key example is the non-discrimination provision in the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs receiving federal funding. Since 1964, similar requirements have been established to protect other disadvantaged groups, including disabled, elderly, and women in educational settings. These requirements extend to areas like environmental impact assessments and historic preservation and animal welfare. As of 1980, there were 36 cross-cutting requirements identified, with 16 focused on environmental protection and 9 on non-discrimination. Most of these regulations have been adopted since 1969, highlighting their significant influence across various federal agencies and assistance programs. In contrast to these horizontal mandates, other forms of intergovernmental regulation are vertical, targeting specific functions or departments. The hope is that horizontal approach ensures a wide range of social and environmental standards. So just like our previous one, can anyone think of a cross-cutting example, maybe something similar to what our authors provide us, which was the Civil Rights Act, the Title VI under Civil Rights Act?
Yeah, I have another one on I think the art, or you had mentioned the on environmental assessments, the National on Environmental Policy Act. So
Yeah.
on in my own experience, we were working on a project for affordable housing, and we were running the California's version, the California Environmental Quality Act, and we're almost half or like 90% done with the project. And then the applicant asked for us to apply home funds that are given to the city through CDBG funds. And then that would trigger us not just only having to do the California one, but in order to get those funds, we'd also have to do the NEPA one as well. So I think that's an
Yeah.
example.
That's a
Yeah.
good example. I also indicated NEPA. Basically, that requires all federal agencies assess the environmental impact of their proposed actions before making decisions. It includes preparing like an environmental impact statement. Is that what you guys do?
Yeah, yeah. We because they were 90% of the way done, and then it would require us probably to run studies, and that'd probably take about 7 months. We decided not to do it, but yeah, we would have had to in order to use those funds.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, that's exactly what I had. Anyone else have any other examples? Okay, we can move on to crossover sanctions. Crossover sanctions is used to influence state and local policy by leveraging federal financial incentives and sanctions. This approach allows the federal government to impose fiscal penalties in one program area to affect compliance in another. The example provided to us is the Highway Beautification Act of 1965, which replaced a previous bonus system with a threat to withhold 10% of a highway's construction funds if it did not adhere to new billboard control regulations. This led to 32 states enacting billboard control laws by 1970. Similarly, following the OPEC oil embargo, the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act of 1974 prohibited the Secretary of Transportation from approving highway projects in states with speed limits over 55 miles per hour. This authoritative measure prompted swift compliance from the remaining states. Overall, this strategy illustrates how federal financial leverage can effectively drive state policy changes. So I'm sure by now you guys have caught on what my questions are looking like. Does anyone have an example of a crossover sanction that they can think of?
I'm not sure if this one applies 100% to this, but I'm thinking about the Medicare expansion under the Affordable Care Act. Technically, it was originally mandated for all 50 states. That got turned over by the Supreme Court. So now it's voluntary. States are allowed to participate in the Medicare expansion, but they're offered quite a bit of money if they were to participate in the Medicare expansion.
Okay, yeah. I mean, oftentimes they use like a combination of approaches, so that might fall into the crossover plus a combination of other examples. But yeah, I think that's good. Anyone else? Cool. Well, I had another example of a crossover sanction on mine is the No Child Left Behind Act, which was enacted in 2001. Under this federal law, states that receive federal education funding were required to implement specific educational standards and accountability measures. One key provision of the NCLB was states that had to demonstrate adequate yearly progress in students' performance on standardized tests. If states failed to meet these performance standards, they risked losing federal funding, not just for the specific program under the NCLB, but for other federal education funds as well. This created a financial incentive for states to comply with the federal requirements. By tying federal education funding to compliance with specific educational standards, the NCLB effectively used crossover sanctions to influence state education policies and practices, illustrating how federal financial leverage can shape local governance in the education sector. I know that was back in 2001, but I don't know if anyone who's currently in education is seeing anything like this now, or maybe is feeling the lasting effects of that. If anyone would be able to respond on that. That's kind of like a question within a question that I don't have an answer for. So if anyone's able to shed some light. All good. We'll move on to partial preemption. So our last strategy is partial preemption. To fully understand partial preemption, we have to fully understand crossover sanctions. Similar to cross-cutting requirements, are linked to federal grant and aid systems, deriving their power from the constitutional authority to spend for the general welfare. However, another innovative technique involves federal preemption of state and local activities under the Supremacy Clause and Commerce Power. This preemption is partial. Federal laws establish basic policies, but allow states or localities to manage them if they meet specific national standards. The example given to us is the Water Quality Act of 1965, which set national pollution control policies while permitting states to set their own standards within a year. If states failed to comply, federal enforcement would take over. This if-then approach allowed states to operate under their regulations as long as they align with federal expectations. This technique, known as the substitution approach to federalism, has been applied in areas like OSHA and the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1970. While these laws assert federal control, they enable states to implement their own programs if their standards are as effective as federal ones. The Clean Air Act in particular requires states to develop and enforce plans for air quality, minimizing state discretion and promoting a more centralized regulatory system. This approach enables national policymakers to mobilize state and local resources effectively, challenging traditional notions of federalism by creating a unitary vision of governance. Anybody able to think of an example of partial preemption? Well, another example that I was able to find on my end is the Safe Drinking Water Act. This federal law established national standards for drinking water quality to protect public health. However, it allows states to set and enforce their own drinking water standards as long as they're at least as stringent as the federal requirements. If a state doesn't adopt regulations that meet federal standards, the EPA has the authority to step in and enforce the federal standards directly. This system enables states to exercise control over their water quality management while ensuring that a baseline of protection is maintained at the federal level, demonstrating the concept of partial preemption. Okay, kind of like we mentioned earlier, there's different applications and combinations of all the techniques provided to us from the reading. For review, the four main techniques used by the federal government to regulate states and localities are direct legal orders, cross-cutting requirements, crossover sanctions, and partial preemption. Each technique has unique characteristics and presents various challenges in policy, law, administration, finance, and politics. Among major regulatory statutes, cross-cutting requirements and partial preemptions are more common, while crossover sanctions and direct orders are relatively rare. These techniques can also be combined, as seen in the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1970. The law primarily employs partial preemption, requiring states to create state implementation plans to meet federal air quality standards, which the EPA must approve. If a state implementation plan is deemed inadequate, the EPA will impose its own. Additionally, the Act includes tough crossover sanctions, such as barring federal grant awards in regions not meeting air quality standards. It also utilizes cross-cutting requirements by prohibiting financial assistance for activities that do not conform to state SIPs. Fund termination is similarly used to enforce compliance with non-discrimination requirements, resulting in the loss of aid across multiple programs for discriminatory practices. I know it was kind of a lot, a handful of different examples, but thanks for your patience and your ears. I hope that we can all have a better understanding of those four strategies.
Okay, thank you very much, Caitlin. And yeah, that is the primary utility of this article by ACAR. Surprised with this typology of the four different types of mandates, as you discussed: direct order, cross-cutting, crossover, and then preemptive mandates. And the article focuses primarily on partially preemptive mandates. There are also what we call fully preemptive mandates. Fully preemptive mandates kind of take on the flavor of a direct order because it's saying you may not make law in this policy area, period, end of story. And I think what Caitlin points out, which is a really important point for us when we look at this typology, is that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And so you'll see a direct order type of component in a cross-cutting mandate. You'll see a direct order type of component in a crossover mandate. But the big difference is a direct order mandate is something typically that Congress has the constitutional authority to do. So this falls within the enumerated powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Then that is something they can issue a direct order mandate in that policy area. And so this is why, as we had talked about in a previous class session, one of the ways in which Congress expands its power over subnational governments is by leveraging the Commerce Clause. And we know in the enumerated powers of Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the ability to regulate commerce among the states. And so whenever Congress is able to say, yes, there is a direct connection, a direct nexus between what we are ordering the state to do and the regulation of interstate commerce, then they have the constitutional authority to do it. And that's when they can issue this direct order type of mandate. Now, at certain points in time, the Supreme Court has taken a very permissive approach to this nexus, where the nexus has not really been as clear and concrete as perhaps the Supreme Court expected it to be at other points in time in our history. I think we had mentioned the Wickard versus Filburn case from back in the 1840s, dealing with the production of wheat. That's an example of the Supreme Court making a very tenuous link between the regulation of the amount of wheat that can be produced and the regulation of interstate commerce. But then, as we had mentioned in the previous class, in the 1990s, we saw the Supreme Court get a lot stricter in terms of the need to have this nexus between the direct order and the Commerce Clause. And we saw that with the Brady bill, the Brady case, the Prince versus United States case, where we ended up with this Prince entitlement, that you cannot tell a subnational government to do something unless it is directly connected to the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. So when Congress has this power, where it falls within their enumerated powers, they can issue a direct order mandate. A direct order mandate is very clear cut. It's a very simple thing for Congress to do. You don't have to worry about a lot of other mechanisms to assure compliance. You can just say, subnational governments, you have to do this under the threat of civil or criminal penalty. So direct order mandates are only when Congress really has constitutional ability to do so. When Congress lacks that constitutional authority to do so, that's when we start to see some of these more creative mandates, such as what Caitlin told us about with crossover mandates. And as Caitlin tells us, crossover mandates, good examples are things like the Highway Beautification Act, the example I provided in a previous class about blood alcohol content levels, trying to impose a national speed limit. The Constitution does not provide Congress with the ability to regulate national speed limits, does not provide Congress with the ability to regulate national blood alcohol content levels, doesn't necessarily give Congress the ability to tell states where to put their billboards along their roads. So instead, what it has to do is it has to try and put a mechanism in place that will then incentivize, if you will, state and local governments to abide by this order. And so if you don't do what we want you to do in this policy area, then we're going to take money away from you in sometimes a different or a very related policy area. So Highway Beautification Act, if you didn't abide by these regulations in terms of your billboards, you're going to lose federal transportation money. National speed limit, if you don't adopt the 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit, we are going to take ICE-T money away from you. And ICE-T used to be what was called the Intermodal Surface Transportation Act, and it was known as ICE-T. That's how the federal government then funded a lot of these improvements, a lot of these modifications to highways and to roads. If you don't do what we want you to do with speed limits, we're going to take that ICE-T money away from you. Same type of thing with blood alcohol content levels in the Clinton administration. Crossover mandates are oftentimes viewed by subnational governments as being these insidious mechanisms because they will take money away from you over here if you don't do what the federal government wants you to do over here. As Caitlin pointed out, crossover mandates are not as common as a lot of the other mandates that we see. The federal government oftentimes gets a lot of pushback with these crossover mandates, and oftentimes crossover mandates are really not as effective as you would initially think they would be. Now, in the Highway Beautification Act, they were effective. In blood alcohol content levels, they were effective, but they were ineffective in terms of the national speed limit. Hence the reason why we don't have a national speed limit, and speed limits will vary depending upon state law. State of Pennsylvania was one of the major holdouts and would not adopt a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, even though it lost hundreds of millions of dollars in federal highway funds. So sometimes you're successful with it, sometimes you are not. Cross-cutting types of requirements, as Caitlin pointed out, usually that's for anti-discrimination. And so you may not discriminate in the fields of education or housing or employment. Pretty much across all these different policy areas, you are not allowed to discriminate. So it cuts across all those different policy areas. And then the preemptive mandates, as Caitlin pointed out to us, we see a lot of partial preemption in terms of environmental regulation. So here's the federal minimum standard. State governments, you can go above that if you would like, but you cannot even have a state standard that is less strict than the federal minimum standard. So you are preempted from passing a law that is less strict than the federal minimum standard, but you are still free to go above and beyond that. We kind of saw that we'll call the minimal approach to partial preemption in a lot of our environmental regulation through most of our presidential administrations. I think I had mentioned in a previous class, in the Trump administration, we saw more of what's called a maximal type of an approach, where the federal standard was, instead of being viewed as a minimum standard, was then being viewed as a maximum standard. And so the Trump administration would come to California and say, this is the federal maximum standard, and you cannot go above that. You cannot have a stricter standard than what the federal government says that you must have. So it's kind of the minimal versus the maximal type of an approach to a partially preemptive mandate. Again, that happens a lot in environmental protection with water quality and air quality and all those good types of things. I think I had given you an example in a previous class about full preemption, and I had made mention to the idea of internet access taxes. And when Congress came in and said, you 10 states who currently have internet access taxes as of January 2007, you may no longer have those types of taxes. So it completely preempted the ability of state governments to have internet access taxes. When does the federal government use each of these different types of mandates? Well, my favorite answer, it depends. So again, if they have the constitutional authority, they will probably use a direct order mandate. If they don't have the constitutional authority, they'll probably default to a crossover mandate and withhold federal money. Now, we know from one of our previous articles, the withholding of funds is sometimes more of a threat than it's actually an action that's taken by the national government. So it really depends upon where they're withholding that money from. Cross-cutting mandates, we know those tend to be used when you need to apply some type of direct order to a variety of different policy areas. That's when you tend to use a cross-cutting mandate. Partially preemptive mandates tend to be used whenever you want to impose a federal minimum standard, but still leave some flexibility and discretion to subnational governments. So again, the primary utility of this article from the ACIR is just to give us this typology of the different types of mandates that will help us understand how all mandates are not created equal. And there are different types of mandates used by the national government for different types of national objectives. And then overlay on top of that the idea of the amount of funding that is then provided for those mandates. Are those mandates fully funded, which the vast majority are not? Are they partially funded or are they unfunded? And that then is a good segue into our next article, which is The Politics of Unfunded Mandates by Paul Bosner. And that one belongs to Vu. So I will turn the floor over to you.
All right, yes, sir. I'm an amateur in Zoom here, so bear with me for a second. Okay, so today we're going to discuss The Politics of Unfunded Mandates by Paul Posner. In this presentation, we'll explore Posner insights on federal mandates and how they affect our organizations. As professionals from cities and special districts and nonprofits, I'm sure each of us encounter federal mandates in different ways. And at the end, I encourage you to share your experiences and perspectives as we dive more into this topic. So let's start with the basic of what are unfunded mandates. An unfunded mandate requires state and local governments to implement policies without receiving the necessary funding from the government or federal government in this case. Historically, before the 1960s, Congress deferred to the state and local governments, respecting their autonomy. During the 60s, as national priorities expanded, the difference faded. Then during the 1970s and 1980s, the federal government increasingly relied on mandates to achieve objectives that require local implementation. And in Posner's view, this marked a fundamental shift in federalism and changed it from voluntary cooperation to what he calls coercive federalism. So why these mandates? The question is, why did the federal government start using mandates? Posner suggests it's partly because of increased media attention and public demand for action on issues like education, environmental, healthcare, and crime. Mandates allow federal policymakers to address these concerns without committing substantial federal funds. In essence, they're shifting the financial and operational burdens on local agencies. The shift led to transformation in federalism from what he called cooperative federalism that was built on partnerships and often incentivized by grants where local governments can choose whether or not to participate to what he also coined coercive federalism, which mandates compliance, often with minimal funding from the federal government. This evolution reflects a broader nationalization a policy, an idea Posner argued erodes the local autonomy and like we mentioned in previous presentation, places an added strain on local resources. Initially, the federal government often used grants to encourage state cooperation. Over time, as these programs took root, mandates became more of a permanent fixture to ensure national uniformity. Posner argues that as policies became standardized, state lost some flexibilities in their ability to adjust their local needs specific to each state. Local governments, including agencies like the ones you and I work at, have sought to modify mandates to better fit our needs. Through lobbying, we've achieved some success in gaining concession on implementation timelines and funding support. So a lot of time there'll be mandates that are perceived as unattainable. What some agencies, including mine, would do would be to lobby for either more of an incremental compliance timeline over time, or additional money so that we can be in compliance. However, Posner notes that these small wins ironically strengthen the mandate's legitimacy, making it more challenging to eliminate the mandates in the future. Posner calls this phenomenon cooperative mandating. When state or local governments successfully negotiate for mandate terms, it makes these policies more palatable and more likely to endure. So if you're able to make the argument for change or flexibility in compliance, you are more likely to be able to be in compliance, therefore making mandates more permanent. This process, Posner argues, adds legitimacy to federal mandates, which can restrict local control in the long run. So basically, in the long run, it is almost impossible to change once there is a level of acceptance from either state or local government. Let's look at some examples. Environmental standards like the Clean Air and Water Acts often come with mandates that cities and special districts, like the one I work at, must follow regardless of funding. Public health mandates, especially during COVID-19, require local compliance with minimal federal support. These examples show the financial strain unfunded mandates can place on local agencies. Posner's main critique is that the mandates undermine the balance of power between federal and state governments by compelling state and local agency to act without providing resources. The federal government is essentially reshaping local priorities. This dynamic, he said, could lead to future where local agencies are primarily implementers of the federal policies rather than being an autonomous entities. The recent reversal of the Chevron doctrine could significantly impact unfunded mandates. Previously, Chevron allowed federal agencies to interpret ambiguous laws broadly, often expanding their regulatory reach and imposing mandates on local and state governments. With the reversal of the doctrine in June of 2023, courts now require clear congressional authorization before agency can enforce such mandates. This change may reduce the number or scope of unfunded mandates, and hopefully that'll be less, as agencies need more explicit legal basis to enforce these mandates. It also shifts more responsibility to Congress to clearly define or fund mandates they want to enforce. For agencies like the one I work at, and possibly yours. This can mean fewer broad mandates and more narrowly tailored federal requirements. So we'll go to some of the questions here. For us, as I mentioned earlier in the other presentation, we have to deal with the more recently EPA regulations on lead service line. I'd love to hear from you guys on how unfunded mandates impact your organization's budget and allocation resources. I don't think I'm able to actually see hands or pick on people, but for us, as I mentioned earlier, the mandates placed a large toll on our budget, being a smaller district, with large reliance on rates, revenue from our ratepayers, and not so much from property taxes. Just having to actually do the work to be in compliance with the EPA regulation actually placed a heavy burden on our annual budget. So I'll go on to the next question here. Are there specific mandates that you find particularly challenging to implement within your agency or your work? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'll jump to the next question here. Have you experienced any flexibility in implementing mandates to through negotiations or lobby? And also, if you can share some examples of successful lobbying efforts that provided your organization with the flexibility or support.
Hi, Vu. I can try to jump in here. I don't necessarily deal with any mandates necessarily, but working within the Section 8 department, we do deal with like very stringent changing legislation and different requirements for the way that we utilize funds. And one of the things that we've been successful in negotiating for our organization is the allowance of using more Section 8 vouchers through what's called public, basically like vouchering through buildings instead of individual landlords. So it's called project-based vouchering, and basically it's like someone builds a 100-unit building and then they lease out 50% of the units directly to Section 8. And so it allows us to have more units more easily. And so there used to be a cap, I think, of about 15 or 20% of your Section 8 vouchers could be utilized in this way. And we were successful in getting HUD to allow us to do something like 30 to 35%. And it's something that's becoming more popular in housing authorities throughout the country.
That's a great point, Daniel. Thanks for sharing that. I'm kind of curious to see how the election and also the result of the election, whether there will be an administration change, will impact policies on housing and housing requirement, or at least affordable housing requirements, and how that eventually will trickle down to the state. So thank you so much for sharing that. We'll jump to the next question here. In what ways do federal mandates help or hinder your organization's mission? And then the second question on the board here also, are there mandates that align well with your organization's goal, or do they create more obstacles than support? I mentioned earlier with water, some of the mandates are basically what I consider a government overreach without having the fund to implement, or at least like not well thought out. So I don't know if you guys also experience that. And if you can share with us, I'm more curious about people who are working in perhaps nonprofit organizations and how that potentially impact your organizations.
So hey Vu, this is Emily. Just one example, I work for Fish and Wildlife, and so an example of a federal mandate that impacts my agency would be the Endangered Species Act, and also an extension of that, the California Endangered Species Act too. So those definitely support the organization's mission and environmental conservation, and yeah, that's it.
That's a great point, Emily. Thanks for sharing that. That's something I actually like usually when I think about it, mandates are more of a hindrance and not a support. But you mentioned a great point, so thanks for pointing that out. I guess having the federal support behind your mission of the agency helps definitely in terms of preaching the I guess the message to the public and getting the support from there. So awesome, thanks for sharing that. Next question, how does your organization handle public and stakeholders' expectations regarding compliance with federal mandates? And second question on the board also, do you find that public understanding or the public understands the resource limitations your organization face due to these mandates? For us, when there is a federal mandate, and I'm going back to LCRR, lead and copper rule revision again on the PPA. We definitely use that as a way to justify operational cost when we present our annual rate increase notice or Prop 218 notice to our ratepayers. And we list out a bunch of other lines or federal guidelines and also state guidelines we have to abide by in terms of making our infrastructure um, up to par, so to speak. And that all added additional cost to what we do, and if we are able to place some of that burden on the federal government or state agency, at least we'll be able to justify our cost a little bit more. And we're not doing it in a nefarious manner, but it's actually exactly how it is, because when we're dealing with our ratepayers, they're somewhat educated and very well informed. So as long as we're able to lay out exactly what the justifications are for the rate increases, they definitely support it. I'd love to get your take on it too. If you guys experience any either backlash or support from the public when it comes to complying with federal mandates at your respective organization.
Hi, Boo. This is Claudia. I can't find my raise hand feature still, but I think well, I work at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, so we don't have direct contact, at least through my experience with the public. It's mainly with school districts and being a liaison between school districts and the federal and state government. So the way that we handle, I guess, their expectations in regards to compliances for federal mandates, it's just that's really what we're here for, is just making sure that they stay in compliance and that we do audits to ensure that they're meeting all the mandates, and then assist them, whether it's by technical assistance or just providing extra support. And in regards to, I guess, kind of getting backlash or resistance, we do often hear that again through the districts, and it's oftentimes either from labor shortages and just administrative burden from meeting those federal mandates. So that's kind of more of our experience as the county of office, at least in the department I work at, but I don't necessarily have experience with the public, since the districts are the ones that typically have communication with their communities.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Claudia. I thought my world in water, especially dealing with water quality issues and water related issue was challenging, but I guess you guys on the education side are facing a lot more quote unquote headache than I do. So props to you guys for having to deal with all this stuff, but thank you for sharing that. And I know some of you guys are in nonprofits, and a lot of it has to, or especially funding comes from grants. So I'm curious to see how federal mandates intersect with grant requirements or eligibility for funding in your organization. Do you find that meeting these mandates enhances your organization credibility, or does it detract from other mission-focused activities? For us, like when we do a response to a grant or application for grant, we'd have to wait the pros and cons basically of whether or not they're a co-funding requirement, how much of documentation you have to keep track of in order to even get the grant, or after the grant when we're doing the implementation process. So a lot of time, I'll take Grant to our GM, and sometimes we'll sit over it, and he'll look at me and say, "Great, you found me a $5 million grant, but it is a 50% cost share. So why don't you go find me another 2.5, then we'll talk." So I'm curious to see what you guys are facing in terms of dealing with federal mandates and the effects on grants. Our nonprofit folks must be not present today. So we'll jump on to the next one. We'll keep this one short. So what are some strategies that have worked well in your organization for adapting to unfunded mandates? And are there areas where your organization has had to innovate or adjust priorities due to demand of these mandates? For me, I'm like going back to what I was mentioning earlier, and Emily, thank you for sharing that info. I think you may be the only person that I know of that actually found mandates supportive or beneficial. For me, every time I hear about potential mandates, whether it be coming from the federal government or from the state, I just immediately cringe. And the second question I ask myself is, where's the money going to come from? So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting world we live in, and as Posner mentioned in his article, um, and hopefully things will change with the Chevron doctrine, um, um, as far as being able to like for at least local agency or state agency to fight back or push back, and hopefully get more justification from the federal agency to think about a little bit more before they implement or set these mandates. Um, Thank you so much for you guys for listening. I am done. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, camera this one off again. All right. Thank you very much, Vu. And yeah, the Posner article, there's very little doubt that for most organizations, whenever we are dealing with unfunded or partially funded mandates, those mandates are going to place a financial burden on most organizations. And that's why we see local governments push back so hard on unfunded and partially funded mandates. And I think in a previous class, we had talked about the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act and how the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, its success was a lot more rhetorical than reality, in that there are so many loopholes that are built into the way in which the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act works that Congress can avoid a lot of those requirements in the act whenever they pass these mandates. And so it doesn't mean that they pass a mandate and that mandate by definition then has to be funded. And that's kind of not the way the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act has worked. And so irrespective of having this Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, we still see the national government passing along these unfunded and partially funded mandates onto subnational governments. And one of the themes that we had 2 weeks ago, obviously, was the political aspects of federalism. And even last week, when we talked about the fiscal aspects, we still had this political undercurrent to explain some of the fiscal relationships between the different levels of government. Here, we also have that political undercurrent as well. And Paul makes the argument to us that these unfunded mandates are oftentimes unfunded because of political reasons. Now, oftentimes members of Congress will say, well, we just don't have the money to fund these mandates. We have, we have these deficits and we just don't have the money to pay for these mandates. But these mandates are important, so we're still going to implement them, even though we cannot help state and local governments pay for them. I think a lot of state and local officials will have an issue with that argument because they will say, well, Congress certainly has no problem borrowing money to spend on a variety of other things, but yet it chooses not to provide funding for these mandates that passes on to state and local governments. But the reason why we get a lot of these unfunded mandates is not necessarily because Congress doesn't have the money or isn't willing to go out or can't go out there and find the money. It's because politically they're unwilling to do so. The primary motivation of most members of Congress, I think Posner would agree with this, is to try and get reelected. So to get reelected, they sign on to these very politically popular types of initiatives. And there's a lot of political gain to get from being a co-sponsor on a piece of legislation that is very popular, but there's not that much political gain to get from funding it. There's only downside to funding it because that means that you're going to borrow money or you're going to have to cut other programs if you're operating under a pay-as-you-go type of an approach. There really aren't a lot of political benefits for funding it, but there are a ton of political benefits for co-sponsoring it and introducing it. And he makes the argument that we have a lot of members of Congress, say, who are kind of free agents. They, as he talks about, I think I like his passage on 261 in the second paragraph. He says, the change in congressional incentives was perhaps most important. Most studies suggest that members of Congress, freed from their state and local party moorings, became anxious entrepreneurs in search of new policy ideas and profiles to gain media attention and political support. Basically, he's saying that they no longer really need to work their way up through the state and local party organizations. And if you are relatively, independently wealthy, you're probably going to be able to self-finance your campaign for the House or your campaign for the Senate. If you look at a lot of the challengers in the Senate races that we're watching very closely for tomorrow night, a lot of those folks are billionaires and they have been able to self-fund their own campaigns. And so, since they are not so tied to state and local influences anymore, they don't care that much about the impact this is having on state and local governments, but instead they're out there being political entrepreneurs, trying to get as much support for their reelection as they possibly can get. He also gives us some other political reasons why we tend to see these unfunded mandates. A lot of these mandates are very politically compelling. In order to get political support, in order to help you get reelected, you're going to, as a member of Congress, choose something that is very politically compelling, choose something that voters can really get behind. Well, if you're a state or local government and you want to push back on that mandate, that becomes extremely difficult if it's a very politically popular issue. And so it makes it even harder for state and local governments to push back on these politically popular unfunded mandates. He also, from a political perspective, tells us about the Downsian issue attention cycle. And you may have covered this in your policy class, but essentially when we have these major changes to policy, we tend to have this euphoria where people are really interested in this issue and they're really pushing very, very hard for a policy solution to this issue. And so the solution is oftentimes going to be a mandate handed down from the national government. And so since you've got the public who are euphoric about this mandate, you're probably going to have a very difficult time as a state or local government pushing back against that type of a mandate. You also don't want to be on the wrong side of the issue politically as a state or local official. And so you're a little reluctant to push back on these very popular types of mandates. And then you add into this the Supreme Court. And as we've talked about previously, we've seen the Supreme Court kind of shift oftentimes from a constitutional approach to an issue to a political approach. So when the Supreme Court determines that an issue is a political issue, then state and local governments are not going to be able to get a redress of their grievances against this national mandate by going through the court system. They're going to have to lobby Congress. Well, the problem with lobbying Congress is obviously members of Congress are getting a political benefit from this mandate. So why would they want to abandon it? And one of the reasons I think I'd also mentioned earlier why the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations went out of existence is because they had put together this draft report. And the draft report had actually argued for taking some of these federal mandates and turning these programs over to the state and local level. So rather than having these requirements flow downhill in a federalism type of arrangement, instead turn them over to state and local governments and let state and local governments handle those policy issues. one of the policies that the draft report recommending turning over to state and local governments was the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, obviously, Congress didn't like the idea of a lot of their pet mandates being taken away and then these policies turned over to the state and local level. And because of that, that's one of the reasons why they defunded the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations and why we no longer have an ACIR. So Congress does not really react very well whenever their mandating power is proposed to be taken away from them. It's also been hard for state and local officials to push back on these unfunded mandates because of these turf battles between state governments and between local governments. And so whenever you have this internal conflict that's going on between state and local governments, it's hard for them to put forth a unified front to push back on these types of unfunded and partially funded mandates. We also know from the Posner article that there's this thing he refers to as cooperative mandating. That because state and local governments had so much difficulty stopping the implementation of unfunded and partially funded mandates, they thought they would do the next best thing. And the next best thing for state and local governments was to try and modify the implementation. So instead of trying to stop the mandate, you try and modify the implementation of that mandate. That's where we saw organizations like we talked about 2 weeks ago, the National League of Cities, the National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislatures, U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Urban Institute, getting involved in trying to lobby Congress in how this and federal agencies in terms of how this mandate will actually be implemented. So the focus wasn't on stopping the mandate, it was on trying to change the implementation. The irony there, according to Paul Posner, is that state and local governments had success at modifying the implementation of mandates, but in doing so, they basically made those mandates legitimate. And I think Paul probably says it better than I can. On page 269, the third paragraph down, he says, ironically, the very success state and local governments enjoy in modifying mandates helped legitimize the federal regulatory presence itself. Federal mandate programs are arguably strengthened and made more effective by promoting state and local cooperation in their implementation. State and local authority over the delivery of federally mandated programs were enhanced by it. However, the authority and autonomy of state and local governments over their own public services and values were ultimately undermined as federal programs have grown to encumber a growing share of state and local resources and legal authority. So the success they had in changing the implementation of these mandates really legitimized these mandates and made these mandates legitimate and accepted. And it's kind of this paradoxical situation. The more success you have in changing implementation, the more you're basically agreeing with the national government that yes, indeed, this is a legitimate use of an unfunded or a partially funded mandate. So success has actually led to failure for a lot of these state and local governments. But I do think the roots of these unfunded and partially funded mandates are not necessarily in terms of fiscal austerity at the national level, but rather that they serve as good political tools for members of Congress to use to enhance their reelection prospects. In the same way that Moneypenny and the ASR told us categorical grants also serve as good political tools to enhance the reelection prospects of members of Congress. So I think the undercurrent here for last week with our fiscal federalism discussion is that a lot of those fiscal tools are very much political in nature, and the impetus for them comes from these political desires on the part of members of Congress. I think you have the same type of thing this week. That a lot of these mandates, a lot of these administrative tools also have their genesis in politics and the desire of elected officials to remain elected officials, their desire to get reelected. So I think the theme then is, again, that federalism is political. It is even though it's embedded within our Constitution, how our federal system operates is really based upon political imperatives. And if you want to know why a federal, state, or local official is doing what they do in terms of intergovernmental relations, you oftentimes have to include that political type of components. The Posner article, Paul Posner is if you don't know much about him, he passed away a few years ago, but he used to be a managing director at what was known as the General Accounting Office, the GAO. Today it's known as the Government Accountability Office. After he left the GAO, he then became Dean of the Public Policy Program at George Mason University. Very well-known scholar in federalism. Not only did he have the academic credentials, but then he also had the practical real-world credentials from all of his years as a managing director in the Government Accountability Office. I had actually hired Paul Posner several years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years after his book was published. We were putting together a series of videos on the budgeting and finance elements of intergovernmental relations. And we actually hired him to come in, and we had a moderator do a series of interviews with him talking about the financial elements of intergovernmental relations. And this primary theme that came through all those videos was this theme of politics and how important politics really is for the types of tools, whether they be grants or whether they be mandates, that the federal government uses. When we think about grants, what we talked about last week, we usually think about the carrot approach. This is kind of the warmer, fuzzier type of incentive to get state and local governments to comply with national objectives. Mandates, we usually think about as the stick approach. It's the firmer, stricter way in which the national government can try and get state and local governments to come into compliance with those national objectives. Now, I know it's a little bit early tonight. It's 8 o'clock, but because Denise was unable, she's ill, and so was unable to do Denise was unable to do the discussion leader this evening. We're going to push Denise's to next week. And so Denise will start us, not next week, I'm sorry, the 18th. We are off next week for Veterans Day, but on November 18th, Denise will start us with the American Public Administration article, and that will then segue us into our current events types of articles. So we then have Emily with the Homeland Security article. We'll then have Daniel with Federalism by Waiver. We'll have Dana with the medical marijuana article, and then Lizette with the intergovernmental relations article, the article by Jonathan Walters. And that's what we'll do then on November 18th. Then we get back together in our final session on Saturday, November 23rd. We'll then round out the remaining articles we have in terms of the current and future issues of intergovernmental relations. Are there any questions or any observations or anything at all on these 4 articles and this general topic of administrative aspects that we have discussed this evening? Okay. If not, then you have an early evening tonight, and so you can get prepared, I guess, for election night tomorrow night. We're off next week on the 18th. We do have 5 articles, so it'll be a little bit longer session. Then on Saturday, the 23rd, we'll have 5 or 6 articles, and so kind of buckle your seatbelts because that will be a long one. I assume it'll probably take us the full 3 hours then on that Saturday, and then we'll be all done. Please remember to do discussion forum number 4, looking at intergovernmental grant and ways in which you would change that intergovernmental grant, and also be mindful of our quickly approaching end of our course so you can make sure you get those article critiques turned in before we discuss the article in class. Okay, well, thank you very much. Nice seeing you all tonight. Thank you for everyone who led a discussion. I truly appreciate it, and everyone who participated in the discussions. I hope you have a good week next week as you observe Veterans Day, and then I'll see you again in 2 weeks on the 18th. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thank you.